the young and the restless spoilers ever since the explosive revelation that the enigmatic figure known as Aristotle Dumas was, in fact, her ex-husband Cain. Lily's world had begun to unravel in ways she hadn't anticipated. What initially seemed like a bizarre coincidence quickly morphed into a haunting betrayal that reawakened old wounds she had spent years trying to bury. For Lily, the mere fact that Cain had returned under a false identity wasn't just an act of deception. It was a calculated invasion into the life she had painstakingly rebuilt in his absence. His presence wasn't just an echo from the past, it was a threat, one that destabilized her emotional footing and forced her to confront the very foundation of her trust in those closest to her. She had known Cain to be flawed, but for him to don a new name and insert himself into the orbit of her professional and personal life was more than she could tolerate. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a resurgence of the chaos she had long fought to contain. In a series of jarring flashbacks, viewers were taken into Lily's inner sanctum of memory, where a conversation between her and Cain played out with striking emotional violence. The topic, Colin Atkinson. To Cain, his father had always been a contradiction, part charlatan, part tragic figure. And though their relationship had suffered under the weight of Colin's endless deceptions, Cain had somehow found it within himself to forgive the man. That forgiveness, however, had become the final wedge between Cain and Lily. While Cain tried to rationalize Colin's sins, Lily could not forget. She could not forget the way Colin manipulated not only their family's finances but also their sense of emotional security. Most of all, she couldn't stomach Cain's willingness to reintroduce their children to the man who had once put their entire future at risk. That, for Lily, was unforgivable. And though Colin's death might have closed one chapter, the wound he left in Lily remained open, festering with every reminder that Cain had chosen paternal loyalty over the sanctity of their marriage. The truth was, Lily's anger toward Cain hadn't started with the Dumas deception. It had been building like a slow-burning fire, ignited long before this latest betrayal. Her fury was rooted in a deeper disappointment, a sense of emotional abandonment that came from watching Cain repeatedly side with the very forces that undermined their family. Colin was just one symptom of a broader illness, a pattern of choices that revealed a man who, in Lily's eyes, had never truly grown up. And while Cain might have believed he was acting out of love or misguided loyalty, Lily saw only selfishness, his desire to redeem his father at the cost of her peace and safety. She had severed ties with him not out of pettiness, but out of necessity. It was a self-preservation decision, one that tore her apart even as she made it. What complicated matters further was the reality that Cain's return under the alias of Dumas had not been entirely without calculation. Long before Lily realized who he really was, she had sensed something off, a subtle tension, a familiarity she couldn't place, and an unsettling curiosity in his gaze when he inquired about the Winters family. She had dismissed it at first, chalking it up to professional interest. But the truth now glared at her like a neon sign. Cain had been investigating her life from the shadows. He had been watching, waiting, perhaps plotting. Whether he intended to target the Winters' business, their reputation, or simply to insert himself into their affairs remained unclear. But for Lily, the very ambiguity of his motives was enough to send alarm bells ringing. In a world where she had worked so hard to maintain clarity and control, Cain's unpredictability was nothing short of dangerous. When Lily finally confided in Amanda Sinclair about the situation, her words were sharp, unflinching, and final. She told the lawyer she could not and would not tolerate Cain, not now, not ever. And what made the confrontation even more chilling was that it occurred before the knife attack that would later send shockwaves through Genoa City. Lily's instincts had flared up for a reason. Her distrust wasn't fueled solely by bitterness. It was a protective reflex honed by years of betrayal and disappointment. She wasn't just trying to avoid pain, she was trying to prevent catastrophe. And when Amanda, perhaps still harboring hope for reconciliation, attempted to persuade Lily to reconsider her stance toward Cain, Lily's rejection was swift and unequivocal. Her voice may not have quoted Taylor Swift verbatim, but her meaning was unmistakable. They were never, ever getting back together. In the days following Damian Cain's murder, a shroud of grief settled over Lily like a second skin, suffocating her beneath the weight of guilt, anger, and unrelenting sorrow. The initial shock had ignited a firestorm inside her, one that had been directed squarely at Cain. She had not hesitated to accuse him. In her mind, the betrayal felt inevitable, like a tragic endpoint to a relationship that had long been fracturing along invisible fault lines. Standing in front of Chance Chancellor, her voice tight and trembling, Lily declared with unfiltered certainty that she believed Cain had murdered Damian. Not out of jealousy alone, but because he couldn't bear the thought of another man touching the life he once claimed as his own. In that moment, her fury had eclipsed every lingering affection. Cain was not a man wronged, not a grieving ex-husband, not a misunderstood outsider. He was, in her eyes, a monster driven by possession and obsession. And yet, even as those words echoed through the quiet halls of the estate in France, something inside Lily began to shift. Grief has a peculiar way of distorting clarity, of sharpening emotions into daggers while also blurring the edges of certainty. As the hours stretched into days, and no definitive evidence emerged to directly implicate Cain, a new unease began to take root. Perhaps it was in the way Amanda paused before defending him, or how Chance methodically sifted through facts with a detective's skepticism, unwilling to make the same leap Lily had. Or perhaps it was the stillness of the nights, the unbearable silence left behind in Damian's absence, that began to erode the foundation of her rage. In the absence of truth, anger is merely a coping mechanism, and Lily, for all her resolve, began to question whether she had been too quick to condemn. As it turned out, Cain had not orchestrated Damian's death. The facts slowly, agonizingly surfaced. The knife wound, the timing, the path of blood, it all pointed elsewhere. The real killer had moved silently through the estate like a shadow, leaving chaos in their wake while diverting suspicion toward the man whose face Lily no longer knew how to read. When the truth came out, when the mask was finally ripped away from the true murderer, it did not bring relief, not immediately. There was no joy in being wrong about something so monstrous. Instead, Lily was left with the bruising realization that she had turned on Cain with a kind of fury that could never be unspoken. And yet Cain, despite the accusation, had not retaliated. He had endured the suspicion. He had watched the woman he once loved label him a killer and had said nothing. That silence, at first damning, now felt like restraint, perhaps even love. Back in Genoa City, once the body was retrieved from the makeshift freezer in the estate's wine cellar, once the arrangements were made, once the officials allowed the coffin to be closed, Lily returned home hollowed out by the ordeal. Her days were marked by long, quiet phone calls, first to Amy Lewis, then to Nate Hastings. Delivering the news of Damian's death fractured something inside her, not just because it meant reliving it over and over, but because of the way their reactions mirrored her own. Amy broke down. Nate was silent for a long time before simply whispering, "Tell me when the memorial is." These were people who had known Damian in ways she hadn't, and their grief made hers feel both more personal and more collective, a mourning shared across unspoken bonds. Planning the memorial was a labor of pain. Sorting photos, gathering testimonies, composing words that could never fully capture the impact of the man they lost. And yet it became a vessel through which Lily slowly began to process her emotions. During that time, Cain stayed away. Whether out of respect or guilt, he made no attempt to contact her. But she noticed his movements through the whispers of others, his business maneuvers, his strategic acquisitions, his calculated charm in boardrooms and back channels. Cain was making moves, bold and sharp-edged, threatening corporate entities that had long stood untouchable. Rumors swirled that he had set his sights on Newman Enterprises, on Chancellor Industries, even on parts of Hamilton Winters, though notably never Winters itself. For Lily, this detail mattered. It meant that Cain, for all his ambition and vengeance, still honored some invisible boundary when it came to her. She watched him wage war on the Newmans. On Victor, who had disrespected her publicly, on Nikki, whose arrogance had dismissed her pain. And she didn't flinch. In some dark, unspoken corner of her heart, it even satisfied her. Let Cain dismantle the titans who had made her bleed. Let him rewrite the rules, so long as he kept his war far from her doorstep. The duality within Lily grew. Part of her wanted to keep hating him. It was easier. Simpler. Hatred didn't require vulnerability. But grief had softened her. And now, the memories of Damian, his steady voice, his belief in her, the way he made her laugh without trying, began to serve a new purpose. They reminded her of what it meant to feel safe, to trust, to build something fragile yet beautiful. And as she stared into the void left by his death, she realized that hating Cain wouldn't bring Damian back. It wouldn't ease the ache. It wouldn't silence the what-ifs. But perhaps, forgiveness, tentative, conditional, cautious, might offer a path forward. So when the final flower was placed on Damian's grave, when the guests left the memorial in silence, and only Amy, Nate, and Lily remained by the headstone, she felt a crack form in the wall she had built around her heart. Amy wept quietly. Nate placed a hand on her shoulder. And Lily whispered something no one else could hear, maybe an apology, maybe a farewell. That night, alone in her penthouse, she sat on the couch for hours, scrolling through old text messages, searching for a pattern in the digital dust of conversations now ended. And then, without fully knowing why, she pulled up Cain's name. She didn't call. Not yet. But the act itself, the acknowledgement, was a shift. A beginning. The next few days brought more rumors. Cain had secured another stake in a media holding once owned by Chancellor. The Newmans were scrambling to respond. Nikki had called a private meeting. Victor was furious. And grief is a curious architect. It rebuilds us in strange and unexpected ways, carving out new chambers where love once lived, where memory now echoes and solitude fills the cracks. For Lily, the days after Damian's death felt like wandering through a house that was no longer her own. The corridors of her heart, once carefully locked against the past, now rang hollow with absence. Damian had been a spark. Brief, bright, and not yet fully defined. Their connection had carried promise, not permanence. It had been something new, different from what came before, perhaps even hopeful, but never destined to be legendary. There had been no years of passion, no slow-burn intimacy stretching over a decade, no children or tangled histories between them. What they shared was potential, a future unspoken, not yet fully imagined. And now, with Damian gone, that potential had been ripped away before it could bloom into anything lasting. Lily wasn't just mourning the man, she was mourning the idea of what might have been. In that fragile emotional state, a kind of reluctant clarity began to form. She didn't think Cain had killed Damian. Her initial fury had been fueled by instinct, by a need to assign blame quickly so the pain wouldn't consume her entirely. But time had passed, and evidence, or rather, the lack thereof, spoke louder than suspicion. There was something still unsettled about Carter, Cain's assistant, whose presence hovered around the investigation like smoke without fire. Cain, by contrast, had been oddly still. Not defensive, not angry, just present. Quietly present. And as much as Lily hated herself for it, there was comfort in that. Because for all his flaws, Cain had always been a constant in her life. A disruptive one, yes, but also one who knew her in ways no one else could. Loneliness doesn't make people weak. It makes them honest. And Lily, now stripped of distraction and illusion, had to confront the truth she had long buried beneath disappointment. She had never stopped caring about Cain. The wounds he left were real, but so was the history they shared. And with Damian no longer a living presence, no longer a romantic option, there was suddenly no reason to keep Cain at such a violent emotional distance. That didn't mean forgiveness came easily. It didn't mean trust would snap back into place like a rubber band. But the reality was, the absence of competition softened her perspective. There was no longer anyone to choose between. There was only Lily, her broken heart, and the man who had once held it completely. And then, of course, there were the children. Charlie and Maddie had always been more than a bridge between Lily and Cain. They had been the glue, the mirror, the thread of shared love that lingered even when everything else fell apart. The twins were older now, carving their own futures far from Genoa City, but their connection to both parents remained strong. As many children of divorce do even as adults, they carried a quiet hope that somehow, someday, the rift between their parents might heal. That hope, unspoken but palpable, had always rested in the space between text messages and holiday visits, in the awkwardness of double invitations and carefully separated family memories. And now, with time having passed and wounds having scarred over rather than scabbed, Lily began to feel that hope herself. Maybe, just maybe, reconciliation wasn't about romance at all. Maybe it was about rebuilding the idea of family, not for the children's sake but for her own. Maddie and Charlie still loved their father. They respected him, called him on his faults, but admired the parts of him that Lily had once fallen in love with. And the idea of seeing them smile, of seeing the four of them share a dinner table again without resentment or distance, that idea had weight. It tugged at Lily's heart when she was alone, when she stared at old photos, when she remembered the way Cain had held Maddie when she was sick, the way Charlie had idolized his father's confidence. She began to imagine a future not ruled by bitterness. Not a full-blown reunion, not yet, but a détente. A recognition that love, even when broken, doesn't have to be discarded. That perhaps, with the fire of Damian's death behind her, she could find room.